I'm calling in from Brooklyn today. Nadia, where are you calling in from?
I'm in San Francisco.
San Francisco, yeah. Great. So we've got some others each sides of the United States continent, and I'm sure we have folks coming from all over today. We usually get a pretty good, I don't know how many continents we get. That would be really cool to know. But folks from all over come on the calls, which is really great. So participants are still filtering in. Just to let everybody know, Nadia is having a little bit of an internet issue today. So if she drops out, we're just going to stay here and she'll come back and join us. So I just wanted to let people know that if that happens, then, we'll just kind of wait for her to come back not panic and just wait for her to come back. So just to let folks know that might happen.
Fingers
crossed. I know, I've got all my fingers and my toes crossed. Although, did I feel like I heard once that if you cross all your fingers and toes, it's bad luck? I don't know if I heard that. Is that a wives' tale? It's probably some myth. But I've got them all crossed. Let's see. Yeah, they're still coming in. Is it summer weather where you are still, or is it starting to turn fall?
We don't really have strong seasons in San Francisco, but it is definitely, days are getting shorter. That is what I'm noticing.
Yeah, definitely. Days are definitely getting shorter. Okay. I'm just going to wait just a couple more seconds to see about more folks coming in. Get some water. All right, let's get started. Oh, wait, lip balm. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmarked. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tool, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly book club, and this is our 6th event. This edition of Lead Dev Bookmarked is sponsored by Work & Co. Thank you to them for helping us put this together. We'll be taking questions live during today's event. So post your questions in the Bookmarks channel in the Lead Dev Slack to have them answered. You can find it at leaddev.com/bookmarked. I'm Susan Bond, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup and an executive coach. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me on Twitter at Susan Bond. Today we'll be talking about working in public with Nadia Eghbal. Nadia is a writer and researcher who explores how the internet enables individual creators. From 2015 to 2019, she focused on the production of open source software working independently and at GitHub to improve the open source developer experience. She is the author of Roads and Bridges, The Unseen Labor Behind Our Digital Infrastructure, published by the Ford Foundation, where she argued that open source code is a form of public infrastructure that requires maintenance. And obviously, she is the author of Working in Public. Welcome, Nadia.
Thanks for having me.
So excited to have you. My book, if I had my book next to me, it has lines and stars all over, asterisk, oh, look at this, and notes. So, and I don't like to write in books, but this one I had to write all over, even though it's beautiful. So I apologize to the book. So I'm curious, what made you write this book? Why this topic? Why now?
For me, it was kind of the culmination of a bunch of research I've been doing, as you mentioned, for the preceding number of years beforehand. The reason why I guess I wanted to, why I focus on open source developers at all, I think they're a really interesting topic because when in tech, I feel like we often talk about affecting change and having impact through the vehicle of startups or venture capital funding. And there's sort of that ecosystem that forms around both funding and being funded and then creating companies to affect change. But I was really interested in understanding open source projects because a lot of them are not actually venture backable. Their companies don't exist around them, and yet they undeniably have this huge impact on the software industry because everyone is using open source code in order to do whatever else they want to do in the world. And so I wanted to understand that problem better and kind of create a little bit of a narrative around it's not just about startups in tech. There's all this underlying infrastructure that people don't see and aren't talking about. And it's also, I think, very poorly understood because most people are not really interacting with individual projects or maintainers. And so that was sort of my interest in exploring the topic at all. And after I kind of got maybe 5 years into it, having worked at GitHub, having done a bunch of independently funded research, I just continue to have that feeling of, okay, I'm like talking to a lot of people about open source, and I don't feel like the modern open source experience is really being represented in these conversations. A lot of people who even like think they understand open source are sort of, have this model in mind that is from maybe like 20 years ago about this like highly collaborative, large scale community. And but they kind of forget about today where you have like individual maintainers that are looking after these projects that are very widely used. And so I just kind of wanted to like be able to expand that conversation a little bit and share like, here are the things that I've been learning and that I've been seeing and that I think are really missing from that dialogue.
Well, yeah, you do a really great job of detailing the history of open source. And I'm curious, like, a couple things. What do you think are the biggest differences between the early beginnings of open source and that of today for folks who haven't read the book yet?
Yeah, so open source and the term that we use today, open source, and came into being in the late 90s, early 2000s, like right around that turn, and had been preceded by the concept of free software and sort of like academic versions of this. But like really the way we understand it today is started about 20 years ago. And around that time, the argument that was being made as to why companies should care about open source was really relied on this argument of openness, and it really like went with the whole narrative of like a brand new internet at the time and the promise of people like strangers coming together and working together and can create something really, really great. And open source was kind of this like shining example of like, here's what happens when strangers collaborate on the internet. So it really made sense for the time, and especially when you kind of put it in the context of most companies still using proprietary software and building proprietary software, who saw open source as kind of this like weird hippie thing that some people do, but starting around that time, open source started being taken more seriously as something that like had a business case for it. And the business case was if more people are looking at your code, you have more eyeballs on your code, theoretically you should be able to like find more bugs and contribute more features, and like it just the software can get a lot better than when you just have like a limited number of people looking at it. And so the image that was being painted was literally this concept of a bazaar. So Eric Raymond back then wrote this piece called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, where he said like the cathedral is this sort of like closed off proprietary model where you have X number of people that are working on it and no one else can see it or participate in it. And the bazaar, by contrast, is this big babbling kind of get together where like everyone is sort of like interacting and flitting around. And that was the picture that he was painting for open source. And it worked really well, I think, when not as many people were contributing to open source at the time, and the adoption was just much, much lower. You fast forward 20 years today, and now open source is basically like default. Like everyone, even if you work at a company where your software is closed source, every developer knows that like so much of what they're building on is open source infrastructure and code that is being used elsewhere. So everyone is like very heavily relying on it, and it in some sense it kind of won on that distribution side of like the argument has been made now that that we just like need to use open source for everything, including for business use. And so like I feel like that conversation has already been had. But then on the other hand, when you can imagine suddenly now like millions or literally billions of people that all rely on open source, whether directly or not, the scale of use has just like completely changed in open source. And so it becomes harder and harder if you think about like adding people to a room or something where, you can have a conversation at 10 people, you might be able to have like an event or something at 100 people, but then there's a certain size where when you have like thousands of people where it's just like, it's not really possible for all those people to continue talking to each other. And so what I kind of wanted to offer was this model of it's not just about people like all interacting with each other and actively contributing, but there's also this model where you might have like a few maintainers that are kind of like projecting out to a bigger audience and more casual contributors.
Yeah, and that that reminds me, in the book you divide open source projects into 4 categories. And so I'm wondering, can you describe each one of them and give a quick example for folks who haven't yet read the book?
Sure. So yeah, the interest in developing different models for talking about open source projects kind of came from observing the distribution side of open source, where we have a lot of vocabulary to talk about different kinds of licenses and how open source is used. But then if you think about like how is open source produced, we actually like don't really have that much vocabulary to describe it. It's just sort of like an open source project. And I feel like that's part of the problem is we can't talk about these differences between projects because we don't have the words for it. And so I wanted to kind of shift the conversation away from looking at the distribution side to say like, okay, what's happening on this production side? And what actually makes different open source projects different from each other. Because I think like in conversation, it's very like, it's understandable why a really small NPM library module might be really different from something that is the size of Linux. Like we can intuitively know that, but it's hard. But in the end, like we just call both of those things open source projects. So the framework that I developed came from looking at the difference between contributors and users, and then thinking about projects through the lens of like, do they have a lot of contributors or do they have a lot of users, and how those two things interplay. Historically, when we think about open source, we like typically just focus on the idea of contributors, and we say like every user is a potential contributor, and you know, if you're not contributing, then you're not even like part of this community. But I wanted to say, okay, like it is possible to be like a consumer of open source code, and you still have a stake in the project, but you might not be someone who's actively contributing. And so, yeah, I looked at projects along these different axes of like high or low contributor growth and high or low user growth. And so the four different models I came up with were firstly, federations, which are what we typically think of when we think of an open source project. These are the really big projects with a lot of contributors and a lot of users. So they're very widely used and they attract a lot of people to contribute back. So Node.js might be a canonical example of something like this, where you have a lot of sub-projects branching off, and there are a lot of complex governance issues because you have so many different people contributing to the project. You need to learn how to coordinate with each other. I found that these projects make up less than like 3% of open source projects, even though they occupy a lot of our mind share, because they end up being these really big, famous projects. Most projects, if we just look at kind of like the number of different projects, are not this. But so that's the federation model. The next one I thought about was this idea of clubs, which are projects that have a lot of contributors but don't have a lot of users. And so this works really well for projects that have maybe like more of a niche application. The example I talk about in the book is AstroPi, which is for like astrophysicists, which is like will never become super, super mainstream and widely adopted. But I think often with like open source projects that have an academic application, there's a small group of people that are really dedicated to making this thing happen. And so it's like having like a book club or something like that, where like you might have like a small group of your friends that are getting together and talking to each other. But you don't really expect I guess maybe in this case, we're having a book club that's being broadcast out, but you know, usually when you're kind of getting together with your friends, you don't expect to have much of an audience. It's kind of just like you guys are like working on something. The third model is toys, which I think are probably like the maybe like least interesting one to talk about, because it's both low user and low contributor growth. And so these are kind of just like the personal projects. They're the open source projects maybe in like the earliest stages, where it's kind of just you working on the project, and you don't really expect anyone is like looking at what you're doing, even if it is technically out in the public. So yeah, this is like how a lot of projects start, but eventually they'll probably develop into something else. And then the last type of project I looked at, which I think is most relevant to what is happening in modern open source today, are the stadiums. And so stadiums have low contributor growth, but very high user growth. And there are so many smaller libraries now today that fit into this. Babel is one example that I dig into in the book. And so you have like a few maintainers who might be getting lots of casual contributors and casual commentary from this like sort of drive-by set of participants. But it really is just like a few people that are very actively working on it and who have the context for the project. And so you can picture like being in the middle of a stadium, kind of surrounded by this like very large audience. And unlike federations, like they might not have as many of these governance issues between contributors, because there just aren't as many contributors. And the way that they're managing outside contributions is a little bit more like directing air traffic. It's a little bit less about like, I'm trying to actively cooperate and collaborate with every single person that comes into my project, because the volume is so high and there's such few people to actually process those contributions. And so it's more about, okay, like how do we sort of like filter this high volume of contributions and just like focus on the ones that are most important. I think everyone can kind of like relate to the experience of a stadium. And if you think about like your email, for example, where like, if you're like me, or I hope most people, like, don't really love doing email and have this sort of like, queue. And so when you're going into your inbox, you're like, okay, which are the most important things I need to respond to? Which ones can I respond to later? But it's a very different kind of model from, say, the federations that have very large contributor communities.
Yeah, I think I love that model. It was so good. I have a quick follow up on that. You said federations are about 3%. What would you say is the large, out of the other categories, what's the largest percent of projects? Just out of curiosity.
If I had to guess, it's really hard to like get numbers on some of these things. But if I had to guess, I would say like it must be, well, I mean, really, it's probably toys because most open source projects are not widely used. But like of projects that are widely used, they probably look closer to stadiums than federations. There's just like a very long tail of projects like that. But yeah, it isn't quite apples to apples in that, like, for even though there are fewer projects that are federations, they're still like very important and retain a lot of mind share.
Yeah, I thought that was so important that you mentioned that, because my guess was that you were going to say toys was the highest, because of just what you said. There's a lot of people sort of tinkering on something, but maybe they're not really trying to get a lot of, attention to it and all of that. But I'll tell you, one of the best things about this book was the framework for open source for me. I mean, I've been in technology over a decade, and this was super helpful for me. And I've worked in open source, back the last company I worked for was built on this. But it helped me quickly understand where an open source project might be in the life cycle, and the challenges they face. So for example, on Twitter the other day, I saw someone followed me, and I was, I look at their tweets. I always look at someone's tweets, like, do I want to follow them back? What are they, what are they about? And their pinned tweet was asking for contributions to an open source project. And it sounded like a toy project to me. So I did a quick look on social media for the profile and a couple of other places. And I was like, oh, yep, that's a toy project. And it was really amazing how I could quickly begin to think about their problems and where they might be in that life cycle.
Yeah, that's cool to hear. Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to like introduce that kind of nuance where like there are some projects, especially very early on in the life cycle, where you are very much trying to get more contributions. And so you could, it's not that just because sort of on the grand scale, modern open source is kind of like about being inundated by these casual contributions. For an individual project, that might be actually what they need and want. And so, but we just have to kind of talk about like, what is the type of project, and then what do they need based on that type.
Well, right, because I don't want to go too far into it, but like it makes me think about, I would think there's projects that like try to get people into open source and to contribute, and that might be a good idea, but it depends on the project. Getting more contributors, as you talk about in the book, and we'll talk about that actually right now. I want to talk about what are the biggest challenges each of these face, and I'm thinking as particularly about stadiums and federations, because I think toys, as we said, they're probably, they're still noodling along. But I'm curious about what you think the biggest challenges these types of projects face.
Yeah, so I think it's that difference between coordination versus cooperation for me. And so again, sort of just like on the stadium side of things, or let's start with the federation side of things, is what we might more typically think of when we think of an open source project, where people need to learn how to cooperate with each other because you have a large number of active contributors or like active members of the project. And they all have strong opinions and they all kind of have a stake in what's going on. And so, yeah, I think like when we talk about like governance challenges in open source, like a lot of it seems to revolve around like developing processes that would work for like a large number of members. So that's something I think about when I think about federations. And they're also like, they need to actively recruit more contributors because they are this like more structured membership organization. And so if you imagine like any sort of like a church or a meetup group or something, like you need to both like retain your existing members, but then you also need to like bring more new people in. And so they are always trying to actively recruit more new contributors to the project. On the same side of things, because you just have like fewer people, you don't have as many people to like support this like flood of newcomers coming in. And so you can picture like I'm working on a project with my friend and it's just the two of us. And if I suddenly invited like 10 more people in to work on the project, like it kind of changes the dynamics. Now it's like, we're dealing with a lot of newcomers, and so I might not necessarily want to do that. Maybe I'm thinking more about, okay, like how do I how do I like filter out some of that stuff that's happening? And so I call them like air traffic controllers, where it is much more about like I'm trying to coordinate what's going on out there, but then I kind of have this like shell of support from like other maintainers that have more context for what I'm doing. And so they might be interested in like user adoption over time is maybe something they might think more about, of how do we like continue like building something that people want if it is something that they want to do, but they're not as actively focused on like active recruitment of contributors.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, those two really captured me, because it seems to me, that the clubs, they seem to, because they have like the contributors and the users are so more closely aligned, it seems. Do you know what I mean? Like there's real reasons, for intrinsic and extrinsic reasons for the contribute. So it feels like their challenges, I don't know, I couldn't see as many challenges for them like I can see for the other two projects.
Yeah, or the challenges are like, I think, known or more known because they follow that typical model of like a meetup group or a hobby club or something like that, where like, yes, they also need to focus on actively contributing and retaining contributors. But because, like you said, I mean, the contributors and users are such high overlap, it's just sort of like more natural. It's more like one-to-one kind of human interaction. Whereas like with a federation, they are drawing from a pool of like a very, very large user base. And so they might have more structured approaches to like, we have like a welcoming committee and we have like tutorial stuff that are like bring people on. And so they have to be thinking about how to recruit people more at scale.
Yeah, something that just occurred to me too is like, though, and you probably said this in the book, so I'm not going to pretend like I made some good insight. But one thing that struck me about the clubs too is like they have like this ongoing relationship because there's probably overlap in other parts of their professional life potentially, whereas federations or stadiums, this open source project might be one small part of their work, whereas a club, there's more overlap in sort of that professional as well as the tooling, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about. That's probably true for a lot of those projects.
Yeah, there's just something that occurred to me. So what similarities do you see between the work of maintainers and leaders? Because, as a leadership coach, it struck me that they have leadership challenges that might be similar. So I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, so I think like thinking of maintainers as like leaders or stewards of the project is a really helpful way to like understand their role in the project. And I think it's something that has been vaguely missing from open source when we do overly focus on the idea of like everyone is a contributor. Then it's sort of like, okay, but like who's in charge of this thing? I think maintainers do serve this really important leadership role of just sort of like figuring out how to like steward the project. And so it's like having a host of a party where like theoretically you could have a dinner party where it's just like a bunch of people come and sit at your table and they kind of figure out where all your stuff is in the kitchen and make dinner for themselves. But like it's a lot better when you have a host who's kind of like guiding things a little bit in the background. And I think maintainers do a similar sort of thing where so they might be looking at tons of different contributions that are coming in and they're thinking about, okay, well, which ones do we actually want to accept and merge? And it's not quite as simple as like what is the quality of this individual contribution, but a maintainer also has context for the entire project. And so they're thinking about, if I accept this contribution, like do we want to continue to maintain it into perpetuity? And like, how does this addition of new code maybe like change the functionality or interact with like other existing features? And that's something that like an individual contributor can't have full context for, or probably doesn't have full context for. And it's up to the maintainer to sit there and like think about it. And so that's why like when you think about like a contribution coming into a project, it's not as simple as like contributions can also, they create more work for a maintainer because someone has to sit and go through that process. And say it's not so different from a leader of an organization who's thinking about like, who do we hire? You might have a candidate that you really, really like and is, perfectly qualified for what they're doing, but maybe they just like, you can't really picture them getting along with the rest of the team, or you don't share their same vision for the problem, even if they're very talented. And so those are the kinds of questions that a leader has to deal with. They also, like maintainers end up becoming de facto community managers of their projects, whether they want to be or not. So if conflicts break out in the project, or just thinking about like, how do we create an atmosphere that is like civil? I mean, you are inviting complete strangers onto your project by having something that is in public. And so it's a big challenge of, yeah, you don't know the people that are going to show up tomorrow, right? And sometimes these like big kind of like dramas and conflicts break out. And so how do you sort of like cool everything down and like and help set the right tone of behavior? And I think similarly to leaders, a lot of it is just about like setting a good example yourself. And there for maintainers that are like trying to create sort of like the sort of like culture or discourse that they want to have on a project. A lot of it comes from like, how does the maintainer act? Are they hostile to other people? Are they shutting down conversations that like aren't quite so savory? And so, yeah, I think like the sort of like culture creation or like behavior setting is another role that maintainers have to play as leaders. Yeah, there's so many comparisons that you could make. My friend Ellie wrote this piece about the role of Facebook, of moderators in Facebook groups, and they have a similar kind of role here, where like you might think about Facebook groups as like a bunch of people just kind of like showing up to this thing, and they have a common interest, and like they are, you know, like often very like large and distributed in that way. But there is a set of like admins or moderators behind the scene who are like doing the work to kind of make sure that you are having a good time. And if they're doing their jobs well, you don't even know how much work they're doing, right? And I think it's probably true for like a lot of like managers and leaders as well, where like the goal is to have other people like not think too much about that stuff. That's your job, right? And so you're sort of like doing all this stuff behind the scenes. So I think that's a behavior that is probably maintainers in open source projects are not so different from admins or moderators in like any other sort of online community or group.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point too, that what I loved about the book too. So I used to have a podcast called Indie Dotes, and I interviewed people creating projects. So I interviewed some open source folks, Mike Parham and Richard Schneeman, who you interview in the book as well. We did code triage on my podcast. And what struck me in talking to them is how many the challenges might be hidden, because if they're doing a really good job, you don't notice those challenges, which is like leaders, which is great because you don't know, but then also maybe we don't have compassion for what that maintainer is going through. And that your book, I felt, did a great job at sort of articulating some of the problems they might be facing.
Yeah, it's I think that's like maybe just sort of my goal with like everything that I've been sort of writing and focusing on the years is like, I think there's so much value in just like helping bring awareness to the issue, or that this is even a dynamic that exists, because I felt like when I first started talking to maintainers and writing about it, I just like it felt like there was just a complete maybe like unawareness, and it's not always easy to know like who is even a maintainer on a project, like official delineation on a project. It's not always like clear who's running it, and so you might just, you know, open a pull request and someone responds to it and you have no idea how important they are on the project or not, unless you like dig around a little bit. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of just sort of like thankless work that happens because like it's not even really clear what a maintainer is, or like who is the maintainer of this project.
Yeah, and even fights have broken out on Twitter, people angry at maintainers, and maybe, you know, sometimes a little bit of perspective is there's not always a lot of perspective about what that maintainer is going through and the challenges they face. So I thought this was like amazing part of the book. I try to do the same in my work, so of course that really resonated for me. And there's a lot about naming that can really change things, right? When we just name something and we say, oh, here's this thing, let's point to it. And so one thing on that note, one thing that really stuck out for me, a theme, was that creation was easy, but that maintenance was difficult. And it could be one of the biggest sources of stress for maintainers. And I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about the challenges they face around that.
Yeah, so I feel like when we talk about writing code, but then also just like content in general, there's a lot of focus on the creation side of things. I mean, we literally call people like content creators, but we don't think about like what it takes to like maintain. And I think there's a version of that that's true for like all online content, not just software, but it's easier to understand, I think, in software, because you literally like do need to maintain code in order for it to like continue to function in many cases. And so, yeah, I mean, I think like the creation side of things that's the point where things are like very creative, right? And where like you don't have to think so much about like other people's constraints, or like how is this going to interact with that piece of thing or whatever. You're kind of just like doing something very, very fresh. It's very like greenfield, and I think that's like the fun part of creating it. So we don't I don't think we like really need to like deeply incentivize more people to like create more things, because people just will do it anyway, because like everyone like likes creating things. There's no shortage of that happening. Then the where the constraints start to happen is more in the maintenance side of things. And so like there is, when you're kind of just dealing with like, I mean, a lot of maintainers are doing less of writing code and more of just like, you know, reviewing other people's contributions or giving them feedback, or, you know, trying to fix things that are broken. I mean, we haven't even talked about like security vulnerabilities, which are like can be such a source of stress for a maintainer, where like you now learn that there's some vulnerability in your code, and like now are you going to, you know, drop everything to fix it? How bad is it really? Like, it's all these questions for something that is not even your full-time job. And so, I mean, if like, in a developer's like day job, the most fun stuff is like the greenfield stuff, where you get to like write a new feature or do something brand new. The less fun stuff, which unfortunately makes up the bulk of any full-time developer's job, is a lot of like refactoring and fixing things, that code that someone else has written or whatever. And so when you think about like open source is happening often like outside of someone's job, or it's supposed to be there as sort of like stress-free kind of space, doing all the things that you don't particularly love about like a paid job as a hobby, not that fun. And I think there's a version of this for like online content creators in general, which I try to talk about in the book, where if you like, you know, post a YouTube video or something that goes viral, there might not be a lot of maintenance that's required for that specific video, but then suddenly now you have like a reputation, because like all these people started following you because of that, and you're like, wow, I have all this attention on me, I guess like now I should like do something about it. Some people are happy to just like have a viral video and like, you know, throw it out to the world and then walk away and never do anything. But a lot of people think, okay, well now I need to go make another viral video, and then I'm going to continue to like do this thing. And so like your reputation also requires a form of maintenance. And so I think like, you know, similarly back with open source, where you could theoretically just like publish your code in public and say, I'm not accepting any contributions. And some maintainers do this, and I feel like I'm seeing more of that now these days. Where you're like, it's, you know, if you want to take this code and use it for whatever you want, that's fine. I'm not going to sit here and maintain it, because like that's a lot of work for me. That is not necessarily very fun. And if open source kind of like at this point where it's not always clear how to like make money or capture value from your open source project over time, if we're saying that like right now it's often just relying on intrinsic motivation, then I quoted this in the book, but a developer who says creation is intrinsically motivated, but maintenance is not.
Yeah, it's such a great point to really, again, to define the differences between those things of creation versus maintenance. And it's easy for us to step over, like, create this thing, create all these new things are great, new, like sort of like the new features, you know, so to speak. But then we forget about the maintenance, and that there are real people who are having to maintain that. And to your point too about security patches and like a whole host of other things, like which pull requests do I accept? How does this impact the project, and what is the load that it'll add to me having to maintain it?
Yeah.
And so part of that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, to address some of these challenges too, I'm thinking about like the decision-making process. And again, I'm thinking like back to some of like this, particularly stadiums and federations. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to some of the approaches they take around decision-making and why they might, they may take them.
For different kinds of projects?
Yeah, just like how they go about making decisions, how they organize themselves is really what I'm sort of thinking about. Like, how do they organize getting work done inside that organization? You know, who has the rights to accept a pull request, who doesn't? How do they decide how to self-organize?
Yeah, gosh, it's like different for every project, which is like, yeah, very, very fun to look at when you're kind of like digging out different kinds of projects. I'd say like for federations or anything where you start getting like more and more contributors coming to your project, it's actually not so different from a typical like company or organization, in that like they eventually start to basically like shard off into like smaller groups, right? So you have, for very big projects, the federation style projects, you will often see that they have like even like a public facing governance kind of page, or of like listing all the people that are involved, and they have different committees for things. So they might have a committee that is just focused on security, for example, or on like welcoming newcomers or whatever, internal tooling, whatever it is. And and so like, I mean, yeah, it's not unlike having like departments of people, and a maintainer on that project might actually not have full context for the entire project. They might just have context for like their specific working group or focus, because they are just trying to sort of like break down the work into smaller chunks. For a project that has much fewer maintainers, I think it's a lot less clear. Like if you dig around on those kinds of projects, there's, oftentimes they don't even really list who's involved, because they've not really thought about the need to do that, even if it would be beneficial for them. And it's sort of like a couple people that are kind of just like, I don't know, trying to just like handle everything going on. I do see, even in those very early stages, there starts to be a little bit of a split between people that might be more comfortable with the triaging and reviewing other people's pull requests and sort of like managing a little bit of that air traffic. And then there are people that kind of want to be a little bit more like heads down in code. Like oftentimes you'll see like there's the author of the project who really just wants to keep like doing that creative creation-y stuff. They ideally just want to be able to like write. But if their project becomes very popular, they might attract sort of like a counterpart who is kind of like someone who's out there wrangling all the other contributions, and they might like, review all the pull requests and then like present a few of the
Oh, Nadia froze. We'll just wait a second, see if she comes back. So we'll just wait for a minute. And if you all have questions, she's probably going to drop out and then come back and rejoin us. If you all have questions, feel free to type them into the channel, and we'll answer them. I've got a couple more questions, but I'm totally open to yours. Oh, and you're back. Okay, fantastic. Oh, and she's gone again. The internet, sometimes we love it, and sometimes it's also our biggest frustration. Okay, you're back.
Okay. Now I'm actually back. Sorry.
All right. That's all right. Fantastic. We were just telling them, if they had more questions. So you can continue from wherever you were, wherever you'd like to go.
Like getting on a roll, and then at some point I was like, oh, your face is frozen. And I guess I'm talking to myself right now. But in a project with much like fewer number of developers involved, you'll see this sort of like symbiotic relationship that is, to me, like not unlike maybe like a CEO and a CTO, or a CEO and a COO, where like you might have a CEO is really focused on like fundraising, vision setting, like here's the direction we're kind of going in, is sort of like, kind of wild in that sort of way. And then you have like a COO who's making sure that the organization is actually like running and to like help fit that vision. And so, yeah, it's sort of like that kind of relationship, I think, between like someone who's doing kind of like focusing on creator and someone who's focusing on like more the maintainer kind of stuff. That's sort of like a dream situation though. Like that doesn't happen for a lot of maintainers. They end up just having to play both those roles themselves.
Yeah, which can be challenging depending on what your skills are, because as we know, CEO and COO, as you sort of think about, even though those skills are very different sort of skills.
Right.
So I have two last questions for you. The first one is, in writing and researching this book, what discovery surprised you the most?
I mean, I feel like it was kind of this, I mean, really, it wasn't, this happened before the book, was kind of like the impetus for the book. Like, I mean, I feel more confident now in talking about, there's some projects where you might not want to, get more contributors, or we're trying to think about sort of like how to filter out interactions and stuff like that. But I didn't feel that way for like the first couple of years that I was looking at it, really until I was at GitHub and kind of like stress testing some of the hypotheses. But like early on, I came into it being like, okay, like I'm talking to these maintainers and they're saying that they don't have enough contributors and they're all like stressed out. So like clearly what we need to do is get more contributors, right? And that was sort of, I think, like the prevailing feeling that a lot of people have of open source is about contributions. So if there aren't enough, like how do you make your project more welcoming so that like, and there is something implicit there where it's like, oh, the maintainer is clearly not doing enough or something to get more contributors. And that is, to be clear, true for some projects. There are definitely projects that benefit from like, oh, there are, things that we could be doing to bring in and retain new maintainers and new contributors. And so I don't want to make it so black and white that like that's not ever the case. But I also felt like at some point it's like, okay, like these projects are just like not looking the way that we might expect the project to look, and why is that? And so just having that sort of like mental switch flip of maybe not all open source is meant to be super, super participatory, even if it is publicly viewable and usable, was just sort of like a very important mental split for me. And then I think the other sort of like second thing that comes from thinking about that is thinking about some of these open source developers as more like content creators than like, I guess, like community members or something like that, where like if you do have these stadium style projects that have maybe like one or two prominent developers at the helm, how and their contributions are uniquely maybe important to that project, more so than a casual contributor who doesn't have the same context, then they don't look so different to me than like an influencer and any other sort of social platform that is able to like make money off of their reputation and sort of make the argument of like, I need to be the person maintaining this project for various reasons. And so just like, I don't think the analogy is always like perfectly one-to-one, but it became a big part of in writing this book of like trying to flesh out what those relationships are and what that analogy does look like. Because I think there is a lot that both content creators can learn from looking at like how open source developers are dealing with stuff and vice versa.
Yeah, that also stuck out to me in the book. I hadn't really quite, it was like a sentence I was kind of writing, but you really put the period on that. And I think for a lot of folks, that would be true too. So that was wonderful. Last question for you. How do you see the open source world evolving in the next 5 to 10 years? You know, like any emerging trends that you might see, or even where you think it should go?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely a lot of things I could maybe say about like the just like open source projects themselves and how they're changing, and just like trends in that. But the stuff that I'm personally most interested in thinking about is just like how the people side of things is changing. And I'm really excited to think about what it looks like to have like being an open source developer becoming like a viable career path. And I feel like that is starting now, but slowly. But it seems like GitHub is making really clear investments into that. They launched sponsors last year, which like allows people to sponsor developers, and they're, I think, going to make it possible for like companies to do that and to sponsor developers. And so I just like love seeing that conversation start to open up right now around, what does it look like to, if you create a project that is tremendously valuable to like the entire software industry, like you should somehow be able to capture the value from that. You should be recognized for your work. And so, yeah, I'm excited just to think about kind of those cascading effects where someone who is writing an open source project in 5 years or something, instead of thinking about, oh, this is going to be such a bummer because like eventually I'm going to get overwhelmed. I'm not going to be able to deal with it and I'll move on. They might be really excited because they're like, wow, I get to actually like capture some of the upside of this.
Yeah. I agree. And in interviewing and talking with those folks, I found the same thing. Only one or two had, sometimes they had sort of like the acqui-hire, or they are running a successful business, but many aren't. And yet they put so much time into it. And so I'm excited to see where that will happen too, and what the different tools, GitHub and other places, how we can turn that into a viable career path. Yeah. Thank you so much. This was a great session. Thank you everybody for joining. Our next session will be next week on October 8th. We'll be speaking with Maisha T. Hill on her book, Check Your Privilege. And in November, we'll be talking with Seung Chan Lim on his book, Realizing Empathy. And for all details on our upcoming sessions, head over to leaddev.com/bookmark. Thanks again, Nadia.
Thanks for having me.